I'm Elizabeth of A Literary Princess. If you are new here, welcome. I have a PhD in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists, and as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have the final installment in my series, What I Read for my PhD in English literature, and we will be talking about what I read for my dissertation titled She Wrote Too Much: Overproduction, Canonicity, and Victorian Women Novelists. So I just finished in September, and here is my dissertation. I do have the physical copy. I'm not going to open it up and show you the whole title page because that has a lot of information that you don't necessarily need. So I've been thinking about this video since I finished up in September because I was like, how am I going to do this? Because whereas for my classes, my coursework, I read we would read a book a week and I can hold it up and talk about it. A dissertation is very different. I obviously have my books that I'm specifically working on, analyzing. But all these other things, sometimes I'm reading articles, sometimes I'm reading parts of a book, a few pages. I was scoring for 19th century articles from different magazines, all over Internet Archive and HathiTrust. So I was like, how do I talk about all this? Because my works cited is, it's lengthy. I read a lot. So I decided that I'm going to talk about the works that I read in full, and then a few that I didn't read in full, but that are very significant to my dissertation. And I've also decided that we're gonna go through by chapter. So I was like, God, how do I organize this? It's just under 200 pages. This thing is long. So we're gonna go by chapter, and there are 4 chapters plus an introduction. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's jump in. So my introduction is titled A Damned Mob of Scribbling Women: The Overproduction Critique as a Method of Suppressing Victorian Women's Writing. That damned mob of scribbling women is a line from Nathaniel Hawthorne, actually. So I've decided we're gonna separate each section into primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are ones that are from the 19th century. Now within that, I kind of have my primary sources, which are the books that I really am focusing on. And then I have my secondary primary sources, which are books from the 19th century that I'm using to analyze those works. So I hope that makes sense. Secondary sources are then from the 20th and 21st century those are critical analyses of Victorian books, biographies, all that kind of stuff. So in the introduction, I'm obviously not analyzing a specific book. I'm laying out the foundations of my argument. However, I do have some primary sources here to give some context for this idea of the overproductive woman writer. And the first one that I used is a Henry James short story, Greville Fane. Greville Fane is the pen name of a very productive woman writer in the story who is said to have not actually contributed anything to the language, to literature, despite all this stuff that she's written. It is generally assumed that this is based on Margaret Oliphant, who is one of my authors that we will be talking about in the next section. In a similar way, I used The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, with Trollope's portrayal of Lady Carberry? Yes, Carberry. Why do I doubt myself? Again, a woman who is writing for money to support herself and her family, who writes a lot, but it's not good. So this is kind of what I open my introduction with, is these 2 depictions. I also reference quite frequently George Eliot's essay, Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, which is exactly what it what it says in the title. It is her complaining about these works written by women that she feels are silly and frivolous and don't contribute anything to literature. I also used quite a lot of George Eliot's letters. She complains multiple times about the too much of literature. And so I used her letters to reference that. These letters are in 9 volumes. I mainly referenced volumes 4 and 5. So the introduction, like secondary sources really shine in the introduction. And one of my biggest ones is How to Suppress Women's Writing by Joanna Russ, which basically is just this feminist theory text that goes through all the different ways that women's writing gets suppressed, like how it happens, why it happens. It's a great book. I've actually read it twice, and I highly, highly recommend it. This next one is another major one that shows up just throughout the dissertation. This is Becoming a Woman of Letters, Myths of Authorship and Facts of the Victorian Market by Linda H. Peterson. So again, it's exactly what it says. Kind of the construction of this ideal of the woman writer and how that myth was constructed by various women themselves and their biographers. There's chapters on Charlotte Bronte, on Harriet Martineau, on Charlotte Riddle, a few other people, but I can't remember who right now. It's been a while since I read this. Like, a lot of these, I read them very early in this process and then continued to like come back to parts of them, but never reread them in full multiple times. We then have Edging Women Out, Victorian Novelists, Publishers, and Social Change by Gay Tuckman and Nina Fortin. This is a sociological study of publishers' records, looking at how once the novel became profitable, men started to push women out. It focuses a lot on the differentiation between high culture literature and popular fiction, which is a major part of knocking my stuff over. The cats. Anyway, that differentiation is a major part of my argument. We then have Godiva's Ride, Women of Letters in England from 1830 to 1880 by Dorothy Merman. I actually did not like this book. However, Merman relies a lot on the critiques that I'm arguing against, like this whole idea of writing too much, when she critiques authors like Margaret Oliphant or Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So I was like, yeah, you kind of have to be in here. Another like kind of foundational text is A Literature of Their Own by Elaine Showalter, which is like the original feminist literary theory book. Like, it's from 1976 or 7, somewhere around then. But, and I mean, Showalter did great work. However, she does also kind of rely on some of this stereotype of writing too much. So to be able to point out, okay, like, yes, this book has done great work and we can still use it, but like she does fall into this trap, to kind of show how ingrained this idea of overproduction equals bad has become in our analysis of literature. And the final book I want to talk about from the introduction is The Reading Lesson, The Threat of Mass Literacy in 19th Century British Fiction by Patrick Bratlinger. So this is exactly what it says. It is talking about how over the course of the 19th century, more and more of the public became literate, how authors and publishers responded to that, the different ways that fiction became like mass marketed to appeal to these newly literate working class people. Part of my argument is that so a lot of these women writers were writing popular fiction, or what would be considered popular fiction or genre fiction, which is meant for the lower classes. They themselves are doing that because they need to make money and they know that will sell. So there is this element of classism to what I refer to as the overproduction critique. So this book was really helping with some of that context. On to chapter 1, To Wipe Out All the Books, Overproduction and the Reputation of Margaret Oliphant. So I had two primary sources here. I was looking at the autobiography of Margaret Oliphant by Margaret Oliphant. I specifically used the edition edited by Elizabeth J. because it is the full original text. I also did refer to the initial 1899 edition edited by Oliphant's cousin, Annie Coghill, but mostly I was drawing on this, which is a great autobiography and you should definitely go check it out. The second book I was looking at is her novel Salem Chapel, which is one of the Chronicles of Carlingford. It is a sensation novel and it frequently has the distinction of being considered her most popular and profitable book during her lifetime, but also her worst book. And so in the autobiography, I'm analyzing like how her depiction of herself, their persona, has affected how people view her in her novels. In Salem Chapel, I am looking at how this perception of Margaret Oliphant as overproductive affected how people saw that book and how it has kind of blinded people to the very interesting stuff that is going on in it. Because I was analyzing her autobiography, I also looked at a lot of other autobiographies and biographies of Victorian writers, one of which was the autobiography of Harriet Martineau, which is very large, but it was very useful. Even more useful was an autobiography by Anthony Trollope, because Trollope and Oliphant are really comparable, and his autobiography also did damage to his reputation, but he was still in print way further into the 20th century than Oliphant was. So to kind of see how the difference of gender affected them. I also read it's technically a speech by Anna Jameson called Sisters of Charity, Catholic and Protestant, Abroad and at Home. I was looking there to see how Jameson kind of framed her writing as a form of domestic womanly work, because I think that's very much what Oliphant does in her autobiography. For secondary sources, I read a lot of biographies. There was Mrs. Oliphant, A Fiction to Herself, A Literary Life by Elizabeth J. This is the most recent and the best biography of Margaret Oliphant. There was also Margaret Oliphant, A Critical Biography by Marin Williams from the 80s, which had its problems but was overall pretty good. And then there was The Equivocal Virtue, Mrs. Oliphant and Victorian Literary Marketplace by Vanita and Robert Colby, which I hated, but it gave me a lot to work with about how Oliphant was viewed in the 20th century and how this idea that she wrote too much has damaged the way critics and scholars look at her. I also did read Three Guineas by Virginia Woolf because she talks about Oliphant and her autobiography there. She is not very complimentary. And she's very much repeating this idea of, yes, she wrote too much and that's why she's not great. And then also very useful for me were three bibliographies of Margaret Oliphant by John Stott Clark, who is a big Oliphant scholar. So these bibliographies were like lists of all of her fiction and when it was published and her nonfiction and critical works about her. So these were really useful for just like looking things up and finding things, but also his introductions to each of them were super useful. Chapter 2 is a novel in 2 years was thought the proper course. The ideals of production in Charlotte Riddle's A Struggle for Fame. So obviously my main book is A Struggle for Fame by Charlotte Riddle. This is an 1883 novel following the lives of 2 Irish immigrants as they become writers in London, Glenn Wesley and Bernard Kelly. So this is so interesting because it is a woman writer depicting a woman writer, and Riddle very much uses her life as a model for her character Glenn. So I'm arguing that by depicting Glenn as a high culture novelist who also writes a lot, Riddle is calling into question this idea that overproduction automatically equals the work is bad, and that nobody that writes that much could possibly be a good writer. Because this is a critique she received a lot. She wrote 40 or 50 something books. I can't remember which right now. But this is a great book and I so highly recommend you go read it. Like I can't recommend this enough. It's so good. So to kind of look at a canonical book that deals with similar subject matter, I looked at New Grub Street by George Gissing, which is a bit later than A Struggle for Fame, but is again looking at the lives of several writers and kind of how they go through life. It is bleak. It is really bleak, but it was very interesting comparison. I also just want to mention The Uninhabited House by Charlotte Riddle, which I did read, but I did not reference in the dissertation. However, in this Broadview edition in the back, there are some, hold on, if I can find them. Nope, because we just have a whole short story here. There are some reviews and stuff. There is an interview with Riddle written by Raymond Blaithwaite for the Pall Mall Gazette in 1890. Lady Novelists, a chat with Mrs. J.H. Riddle. And then there is also a section from Helen C. Black's Notable Women Authors of the Day from 1893 on Mrs. Riddle. And I referenced those quite a bit. I also used the introduction to this as a secondary source, which is by a person. Melissa Edmondson. So yeah, this was a very useful book for me, even though I did not actually use The Uninhabited House in my dissertation. A lot of my biographical information on Riddle came from 2 books. There is no biography of her as of right now. Maybe I should work on that. I don't know. So we've got a book, I believe from the 20s or 30s, I don't remember which, called Wilkie Collins, LeFanu, and Others by S.M. Ellis. There is a chapter on Riddle. She is one of the others. And I also used the Stanford Companion to Victorian Fiction by John Sutherland, which is just super useful for a Victorianist in general, because you can like look up pretty much any author or publisher or book and it'll be there and you can read a little bit about it. Also used a chapter in Victorian Metafiction by Tabitha Sparks. So she has a chapter that is about A Struggle for Fame and Margaret Oliphant's The Ethelings. So the difference between authors and their books. Charlotte Riddle's A Struggle for Fame and Margaret Oliphant's The Ethelings. And I bought this specifically because of that chapter. I knew it was there and I was like, I need that. And then the last secondary source I want to talk about for this chapter is Charlotte Riddle's City Novels and Victorian Business, Narrating Capitalism by Silvana Colella. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Now, an analysis of Riddle's city novels, and it does talk about A Struggle for Fame, I believe in the conclusion, because technically A Struggle for Fame is not one of her city novels, but it also kind of is. It's weird. But this is just a really interesting book to get some context on Riddle's fiction, because there's just not as much on her as there is about Oliphant or the subject of chapter 3, Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So chapter 3 is titled What the Penny Public Want, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, Overproduction, and the Popular Author. So my primary sources here were The Doctor's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, a novel that is about a woman who reads too much and how that affects her, but also about a writer, Sigismund Smith, who writes penny dreadfuls and sensation fiction, and his production is shown in a very positive manner. He makes his reappearance in The Lady's Mile very briefly, so I also used mentions of him from there. And then I also used Braddon's letters to her mentor and fellow novelist, Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton. These are found in 2 articles published by Robert Lee Wolfe, who's a biographer of Braddon, who we'll talk about in a minute. So those are printed there, and I am really analyzing the way Braddon talks about her own overproduction and how it is at odds with what she actually continued to do and how she portrays it in her fiction. But these letters are often used to show that she hated writing sensation fiction and that she just had to make money. So those are really interesting and a lot of very fun, and also it's just interesting to see the way she talks to him. She very much builds this relationship of her as a worshiper and him as a god. It's a little disturbing. It's kind of creepy. My friend who would work on my chapters with me at the writing center was always like, girl, this is a messed up relationship. Yeah, it's weird. It's definitely weird. So secondary sources, there were 2 biographies that I used. Sensational Victorian, The Life and Fiction of Mary Elizabeth Braddon by Robert Lee Wolfe. And then also The Literary Lives of Mary Elizabeth Braddon by Jennifer Carnell, which is more recent and actually fills in some information that Wolfe did not know. Books looking at kind of the sensation genre, I went to The Improper Feminine, the women's sensation novel, and New Women Writing by Lynn Pickett. Lynn Pickett is a scholar who came up a lot with Braddon. She wrote the introduction to The Doctor's Wife, and several other things. So this book is really looking at the sensation novel and the New Woman novel as kind of linked genres of defiant women. I was obviously just there because she was talking about Braddon. I didn't need the New Woman part of it. So, moving to chapter 4, a combined total of fewer than 20 novels. The 21st century literary canon and the exclusion of overproductive women novelists. So this is a different kind of chapter because I'm not analyzing a book. I am using a database called At the Circulating Library, maintained by Troy Bassett, which is a database of long fiction from the Victorian period. So he's got the information about how many books, the gender of authors, all this different stuff. So the gender was really what I was looking at. So how many women authors did we have? How many male? How many books by women authors? How many books by male authors? And I was comparing that with what we consider the literary canon, here being the Oxford World's Classics current catalog, which they have on their website in a very handy Excel spreadsheet, and that made me happy. So this method of looking at books kind of through numbers is referred to as distant reading, a term coined by Franco Moretti. He has his book, Distant Reading, which I did not read all of, but there was one essay in there that was extremely useful that I like read over and over again. And The Slaughterhouse of Literature is the one that I used most often, kind of as like an example of why we need distant reading, which is because the amount of literature from the Victorian period is just so much. There were so many books that it is impossible to close read all of them. So this idea of distant reading kind of opens up a way of looking at that and the trends and whatnot within that. My light went off. I also read Moretti's book, Graphs, Maps, Trees, Abstract Models for a Literary History. Why? And then the other big book about like distant reading that I used was Reading by Numbers, Recalibrating the Literary Field by Catherine Bode. And I would say her approach more than Moretti's inspired my approach, just because she is a lot less vague than him about like how does distant reading work. So that's what that was doing. And then there were a few books that I used kind of for more the cultural contexts, one of which was Outside the Pale, Cultural Exclusion, Gender Difference, and the Victorian Woman Writer by LCB Mishi, which I think I had originally read for my qualifying exams, but it was very helpful for the dissertation as well. We then had Too Much, How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today by Rachel Verona Cody. I actually hated this book. However, her idea of like women being too much coming from Victorian constraints was useful to me. Even though I thought it was a bad book, I gave it 1 star. And then the final book that I want to mention that I read in full and made it into this chapter is not one that I read for the dissertation necessarily. It just happened that I used it. And that is Jane Austen's Bookshelf, A Rare Book Collector's Quest to Find the Women Writers Who Shaped a Legend by Rebecca Romney. Yes, I'm holding the dust jacket. I lent it to my mother. So Romney talks a lot about canonicity in here and like why do like these very few women authors make it into the canon whereas the rest of them are forgotten. So that was very useful for my own conversation about that. She also talks about How to Suppress Women's Writing by Joanna Russ, which Romney has good taste. So that's just kind of a quick run through of some of the stuff that I read for my dissertation on Victorian women writers. I don't know if that was interesting at all to you, but I felt like I kind of needed to do this video to wrap up that series of what I read for my PhD in literature. So that is all of it. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of these? What did you think of them? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.